So now we get to move on to and to end on a slightly lighter tone and note by sharing our media picks for the month. And this month, I'll let you go first. What is your media pick for September?
My media pick for September. My media pick for September. Um, it's a documentary.
Uh-huh.
Well, okay, I'll go with the title first because this was part of the controversy, and the reason I picked it, you might see in a minute, because it shows up so much of the media's relationship with archaeology and archaeologists' relationship with the media. It was a documentary that was on first shown on BBC Two. It's still available on BBC iPlayer for another roughly 2 weeks, and it's called King Arthur's Britain: The Truth Unearthed. Fronted, as is the way on BBC Two these days, by Professor Alice Roberts, who is a formidable broadcaster and a wonderful advocate for archaeology and science in general. And what she was fronting in this case was a survey of the evidence for what happened in Britain roughly between about AD 400 and AD 700.
Okay.
And it was also focusing on the recent work that's been undertaken, or at least using it as a jumping off point, the recent work that was undertaken or has been undertaken at the palace complex at Tintagel, which was controversial a few years ago when English Heritage promoted it as an Arthurian site and carved an image of Merlin onto a rock.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think the reason I picked this and the reason I liked it was that it's actually part of a media continuum that dates back at least into the 1970s. I remember a documentary series called, I think it was called Dark Age Britain, in the early 1970s. And that was jumping off from the work of Leslie Alcock's team at South Cadbury, where they claimed to have a refortified hill fort from what were then called the Dark Ages. Now it's very unfashionable to call them the Dark Ages, and we call them all sorts of other things. And in Europe, it's the Migration period, or the post-Roman period, or the early medieval period, or whatever. And it gets tied up with lots of academic, and you get lots of academics, and particularly archaeologists, get very bitey at the mention of King Arthur. Now, I think they should lighten up a bit, personally, because for two reasons. One is it's part of the popular culture, guys. You can't do anything about it. And secondly, the Arthurian references come from a number of documents, including documents from the period. There's the History of the Kings of Britain, which is 8th century, which lists King Arthur's 12 battles. And there's also the Gododin poem, which likens one of its characters and says that he was not like Arthur. So therefore, Arthur is a current character. So I'm sorry, guys, just because there isn't the evidence in the ground for the name of somebody called Arthur doesn't mean you can ignore it. You're dealing with somebody who was part of the popular culture within a couple of hundred years of the events that it's supposed to be describing. So
who also went on to be an integral part of European medieval literature and poetry.
Precisely. And we talked about Dan Brown earlier on, and the whole Grail romance and so on. We're dealing with an absolutely central part of English and European culture. Wagner's Parsifal. So on. So here they were trying to pull back and look at the archaeological context, and they were looking at the work of a number of archaeologists. Dominic Powland, Sam Lucy, that have suggested, for example, that the post-Roman period wasn't a period of conquest by, quote, Anglo-Saxons, but that there was more of a cultural change by sort of osmosis. And like citing modern DNA work and so on, that the idea of a wholesale population transfer is less tenable than it once was.
Yeah. Well, so some of this stuff started. It started with the idea that maybe, well, actually, frankly, it's also been talked about in terms of the Roman context as well. But that maybe the stuff that we identify as being from, say, a Saxon grave, like the brooches or the other grave goods, are actually part of a package that imply a sort of a cultural connotation as opposed to a people moving and migrating.
Yeah.
And the fact that this stuff doesn't continue to be particularly important to people beyond a certain time and place may indicate that actually they reverted back to some other way of valuing. You know, it's like in the 1980s in Britain, for example, people and 90s, people went through kids went through a phase of loving boglins and Transformers. And that doesn't mean that Americans or people, in the case of Transformers from Japan, for example, were moving here and bringing that stuff. It's just that stuff became very, very important and popular to those people at that time, myself included, incidentally.
Absolutely. And we're going to come on to talk about the popular culture and ancient history in a minute. But I mean, I think in this particular context, the other point that it was trying to make, and certainly particularly the work of some people like someone like Sam Lucy, is all about the grave goods. It's about the brooches and the styles and so on. However, I do think that it can be overstated that there's been a move in archaeology in general to downplay the importance of conflict in the formation of populations and the past, and you don't necessarily have to have had a general conflict which leads to wholesale destruction and decimation of populations to have a political impact and a cultural impact.
No,
I think, and I speak as someone who's an archaeologist of conflict. So I suppose he would say that, wouldn't he? But I think there's a tendency on the part of some archaeologists to not to look for the evidence of conflict, and in fact, the evidence may be very difficult to find.
Yeah.
We don't know. Okay, people say there aren't that many burials with traumatic injuries that have been recognised, which is a fair point. But we don't know how big the entire sample is because we're still working on ideas about population, and also there may be regional biases.
Well, but also the scale of warfare. We live in a post-Second World War world where, to us, the word war really implies total war. It implies population decimation. It implies industrial level production of weaponry. Whereas actually a war band in the 7th century could be as little as 13 people, or 25.
Through one ship.
Yeah, exactly.
Through one very big ship.
Yeah, and then a battle, or even if enough of them came, warfare would be occurring. But that's not necessarily, but that's a whole scale that may even be archaeologically invisible. You don't even necessarily see some of these things happening. But the effect in terms of, as I say, popular culture, effectively, in terms of the stuff that ends up being transferred through trade or through just people leaving things in certain places, is something which we can see, and therefore we have to explain it in some way. So yeah, it's an interesting point that you make, not to discount the Arthurian legend. It's an interesting.
I'm not saying the Arthurian legend is like watching a news bulletin.
Yeah.
But what I am saying is that back at the point of origin of these documents as we have them, you can't discount that actually the originators of those stories were describing something they'd seen, or been told about, that they had sources that we no longer have, that they had.
Well, and in a similar time depth, we don't discount the existence of Samuel Pepys.
Precisely.
He existed, and we have his diary. In 1,000 years' time, they may go, Samuel Pepys might not have existed, just because they were saying he was in the year 2018. That's
exactly right. So the reason I particularly like this, just to sum up, really, it was a well-made documentary. It had some good, a well-chosen group of talking heads. They were allowed to make some interesting points. There's some very interesting graphics, including some of the modern applications of GIS and remote sensing that's been taking place in terms of the rural settlement patterns in that period. And it's part of a media continuum, really, going back many decades now, with that particular story, that particular piece of culture, being used as the springboard for archaeological television. And I suspect that if we were talking about this in 30 years' time, whatever media sources people are watching, then there'll still be people doing Arthurian-themed, or at least Arthurian-titled programs.
Yes, on their holographic smartwatch displays, yes.
Absolutely, yeah. Like, in this case, the Arthurian title was actually a hook.
Yes.
It was actually about that was to hook in the general audience. And for my for any colleagues who say that's not appropriate because Arthur didn't exist and it wasn't about people, it distorts discussion of the period to talk about Arthur. I have to say, tough, because I think. If we were talking earlier about communication, and sometimes you have to use a shorthand and get people excited and interested. And if the mention of King Arthur got people watching, who then got to see some really interesting remote sensing about early medieval settlement patterns in Yorkshire, then that's great.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can buy into that. That makes sense. Yeah. Comparatively briefly, I'll just say that my media pick of the month is a computer game, and it's a computer game that I was lucky enough to get my hands on a little bit ahead of time, and that was Assassin's Creed Odyssey. It's been wonderful.
I told our son that you managed to get hold of a review copy of it, and I won't tell you what his reply was.
Surely he was just excited for me. He was very happy, I'm sure.
Well, he was casting aspersions about your parentage, shall we say.
I see. Okay, fair enough. Well, well, you can tell him that it's wonderful, and actually, as I touched on earlier in this watching brief in a previous segment, the context of the Greek world has been realised extremely well in this game. I haven't finished it by any means. I'm about 2% into the game after a few days of solid gameplay, for work purposes, I might add.
Archeo gaming is a recognised subdiscipline these days.
Absolutely.
Don't need to apologise.
No. But it's the thing that I'm genuinely enjoying, and the thing that I'm really taking my time over, is the representation of the physical, architectural, and cultural realities of living in ancient Greece at the time. Now, there are some things that I have raised an eyebrow about, and that you could culturally criticise. For example, they felt the need in this game to have a male and a female protagonist whose dialogue and the response to whose is precisely the same. So when they talk to people, they use the same words and the same inclination, and when people talk to them, they likewise. There's no actually, ironically, even though you get to play as either male or female, there's no recognition that you're playing as a different gender, or a different person. And I think that's a bit of a shame, in so much as in context in the ancient Greek world, a female warrior, and as far as we can tell, there probably were some. They're definitely, you see them in statuary and sometimes in artwork.
Certainly culturally they were, yeah.
Yeah, nonetheless, was unusual. And to have, so in this case you're playing as a Spartan character who is living on Kefalonia during the time when the Spartans and the Athenians are about to enter into the Peloponnesian War. You are in a situation where your parentage is a Spartan, but also the fact that you are a woman, for example, who seemingly owns property, that you are fighting people, that you are telling men, to do things. This stuff would be questioned by lots of men in the ancient Greek world, because certainly in the Athenian context, women were property. Women were also actually only related in terms of their value, in direct reference to their male relatives. So in particular your father, and then your husband, and in some cases your brother, would give you a legitimacy as a human being.
And as I understand it as well, spent a lot of their daily life in a domestic context within the bounds of a house or an estate.
Yeah. And again, in the Athenian context, and we know most about the Athenians because they wrote more than, for example, the Spartans did. Women often wouldn't start counting how old they were until they were married. So they literally they did not even count, literally, until they were married. And so I'm not saying that's exactly what we should be showing and absolutely representing in its entirety. You shouldn't have to play as a subjugated female person, but I think it would add to the spiciness of the game if you saw certain men going, "Hey, you can't talk to me like that," and then you get to maybe punch them in the face. It would be if they want to have a powerful female character, maybe play that off against men and a society, certainly again in the Athenian city-states, who do not expect that. And highlight that, as opposed to simply presenting a male and a female character who are precisely the same, because that, in some respects, makes the choice irrelevant. And so, it's still, to me, it's both small and it's also huge in terms of how you play the game.
It's interesting they've made that choice, because I mean, and we've talked about her very often on watching briefs, and particularly in the media sections. But people, I think, have stopped asking whether making Lara Croft female would stop men wanting to play Tomb Raider.
Yeah.
As far as I'm aware, it hasn't really had that much of it. So would the opposite apply in Assassin's Creed? Because I think I'm right in saying in previous iterations it's been a male protagonist in Assassin's Creed.
Yeah. Well, and in Assassin's Creed Unity, there was lots of ink spilled. Lots of journalism covered the fact that the game allowed you to be a male or female character in the multiplayer, but in the single player campaign you could not choose to be a woman. In the follow-up in Assassin's Creed Origins, my understanding is that they did not have a female protagonist either. And in this one, you basically you can play as a brother or sister, essentially, from a certain family.
I mean, maybe an unfair question to ask you, because you may not know the answer. But I mean, it strikes me that one reason for them not going down that route might be, though, that in terms of cost and development time, you're effectively having to have a parallel game. Where
well, actually, so you mean in terms of what I was suggesting, in terms of having yes, well, exactly, yes, you would have to have a parallel game. That said, though, if we're going to get really into the woods or into the weeds on game development. In the recently released Spider-Man game on PlayStation 4, they took the time to record 2 sets of dialogue for Peter Parker as Spider-Man, for every single conversation he has. So, and these 2 sets of dialogue was 1 when he's stationary and 2 when he's swinging. So if someone calls him up and you start talking, about, "Oh, hi Aunt May, I'm late for my dinner," if you're not moving, it's one voice, and or one delivery. If you are moving, it's another one to reflect that motion. So you can have actually these parallel realities within the same story structure. I don't think you'd have to necessarily change the dialogue or the actual way in which the character moves through the game. Just have the character, some of them just basically being a bit surprised, because I think it actually downplays the value of being able to choose a man or a woman in ancient Greece, because obviously this is not a 21st century setting. If none of the men go, "Oh," kind of thing, like, why? How? How? Well, frankly, what are you doing selling a sword? For example, you're not allowed to have property. Where's your, this kind of thing. Just imply that in the tone and let people maybe think about why that tone is there, and it would probably add actually to the conversation, and also the reason for being able to choose between the two.
Can I just interject there for a second, and with another question really, and it sort of goes back to earlier Assassin's Creed games, but also actually to the discussion we were having earlier in this watching brief about Bosworth, because one of the defining things about Assassin's Creed, as the series has developed, has been the attention to period detail in whichever location they've been setting, whether it's revolutionary Paris or Renaissance Florence, or most recently in ancient Egypt, where they even released an iteration of the game world which could be used for teaching children about Egyptology. Or teaching students about Egyptology. And this is in the context of where we've had at Bosworth a developer arguing that they can mitigate the damage done by the destruction of an archaeological site by creating a 3D computer model. It strikes me that those two things aren't unconnected. The attention to detail that can now be brought to a computer environment, as expressed through things like these historical settings in the Assassin's Creed series, are beginning to have a crossover into wider practice, not necessarily, arguably, for the good.
Yes, in so much as Assassin's Creed Odyssey is not a perfect representation of the ancient Greek world. The scale is much smaller, even though it feels like it's a very big map that you're on. I haven't even actually got round the Spartan Peninsula into the Aegean yet. It's so big. But even then, I mean, Kefalonia, the island, is about 1/10 of its actual size. You can see from one coast to another in certain points of the island. You can't really do that in real life. So there's the physical reality that's being compromised, I suppose, in the presentation of the digital world. There is the need to have it, I suppose, have an aesthetic which is always pleasing. So, for example, on Kefalonia in the game, there is a huge statue of Zeus who is 30 feet tall. You know, he's kneeling on top of a mountaintop, and he's throwing a lightning bolt, and that's a wonderful visual. But that wasn't in the real Kefalonia. There's the cultural elements which we've touched on as well, and I suppose what I would say is that it's not always for the positive, because the people doing that work often feel compelled to make it better, past plus, as it were. But also, I guess that there is great potential as well in presenting historical worlds in this way. For example, I'm very much enjoying the fact that in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, we are exposed to architecture and the realities of for example, statuary, which we don't commonly see represented in, especially in pop culture, but also in our museums. Basically, painting. The fact that every statue was fully painted to look like a giant human being with colourful clothes and flesh-coloured skin. The fact that the obelisks, pillars and other features on buildings were painted with stories and rich texture. That's the positive. The positive is the ability to actually experience something which I think archaeologists often routinely imagine when they see these things. We often routinely imagine the rich texture, or when we see like a ruin of an abbey, how that architecture would be finished off and what it would be like to be in that building, and the smells and the sights and the sounds. That's the value of it. And I think the weirdness, though, especially in the context of Bosworth and the battlefield, is that it cannot present the totality of what was there, because we don't know what was there, because the site is, if certainly there's archaeology yet to be done, or archaeology that ideally may never be done, because we're trying to preserve that for future better other techniques that don't require the site to be destroyed in order to fully understand it. So we can present a facsimile in all contexts. Like, I suppose it's always going to be a facsimile in these digital contexts. I guess it really comes down to the motivations of the person or the people who are producing that facsimile. And in the case of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, I think they, and frankly all of the Assassin's Creed games, I think they genuinely have a desire to walk a line between entertainment, really entertaining, really compelling gameplay, and also actually a story. In the case of Odyssey, which is also quite compelling when you start to get into it. But also, they seem to care about getting the texture right, and I think that's the difference, isn't it? You can have a texture of what it's like to be, for example, in Britain. You can eat some Yorkshire puddings and mashed potato, and you can go and look at Big Ben and stand in a red phone box, and that's the texture. Whether or not you can actually experience all that stuff in a 1.5 metre square plot of land anywhere in Britain, I think is highly debatable. You couldn't do that, but the heart is there. I think the intent is, I think ultimately it's one of those things where if you're going to make a game set in ancient Greece, you might as well do the research. If you're going to do the research, you might as well start to apply it quite well. And I think broadly speaking, Ubisoft do that, and I tend to enjoy their games because of it, I think.
So, I mean, I suppose the ultimate question is, actually, in the end, it's like a movie. It's an entertainment, and is it fun? Is it a fun game to play? Is it is it worth your 40 quid? For those of us that don't get a review copy.
Well, I was going to say actually, it's more like 60 quid. And actually, if you buy everything that's associated with the game, for example, all the add-ons, it's more like 120 quid actually. Which I did not get those add-ons as part of my review copy. So yes, it is worth it if you're going to actually play. I think another problem as well is that lots of people they play these games in very short bursts, and what they tend to do then is move on to the next thing, especially if they have the money. Lots of reviewers as well put it in that context of, well, basically, oh, this is a huge game. It requires lots of work to get anywhere in terms of leveling up, and there are options in the game to, for example, buy extra XP or extra money to help you get through the game quicker. Yeah. I think
it's very controversial in the gaming world, isn't it? The idea that you can buy success. It's a bit like being Manchester City.
It is a bit like being Manchester City, and some people want to be Manchester City, and I think that's okay. I mean, there's a whole other thing in terms of loot boxes and gambling, and that's something else entirely. But if you want to be able to get through this game quickly, you can. But I don't think the game therefore is actually worth it if you just want to just plough through for the sake of it. But I think if you want to really play, this is much closer to an RPG in that sense, a role-playing game, than it is to an action-adventure game. This is much more an opportunity to try and inhabit a character, to try and inhabit a world, and try and move through that world in a way that makes sense. There's the fluidity in the gameplay. There's a even compared to one of my favourites, Assassin's Creed games, Black Flag. There's a freedom actually to approach things in a way that not only makes sense in the world, but also that you can use your imagination to solve problems. That means that actually, if you're playing this game, I think properly, it is worth the money, because you're going to be taking your time. You're going to be reading the landscape. You're going to see how actually watching things and seeing how things play out pays off, and it's all worth it. Yeah.
What one sort of last thought I've got? We're dealing here with a work of creativity in which exists in a real world context. You could argue that people these days revisit the Arthurian story, which we were just looking at, because it's about the definition of England or Britain in relation to Europe. The Saxons are the Europeans coming to take over control, and Arthur's fighting for independence. Or if you take a more benign view, that Britain has always been part of a northern European world geographically, and it's impossible to try and buck that trend. In Greece, you're talking about the fount of European classical culture, but that's often been presented as white, and there was the whole Black Athena controversy. So how do they deal with issues? And I think also there was another. I think it's Kingdom Come Deliverance has been accused of presenting a very white, in fact, view of medieval Europe.
Yeah.
On the part of the developer. So how do they deal with issues of slavery and diversity and things like that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting also that you should mention slavery, because okay, well, okay, fine, yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking, this segment's getting a bit big, a bit long, isn't it? But
sorry,
okay. No, it's fine. I mean, if you're interested in it, other people may well be as well. So, a game, for example, like The Witcher 3. Witcher 3. It wasn't free. It cost a lot of money. The Witcher 3. That was criticised. Oddly enough, in the other direction. Some people were saying that they were trying too hard to include diversity into their medieval-ish world setting. Obviously, it's a fantasy world, so in that sense, they can do whatever they want. They can have blue people; it doesn't really matter. But actually, what they were doing was, in fact, drawing on Polish mythology, I believe, to make that character, and it's also based on a series of books, and therefore there actually was a desire to represent a sort of realistic medieval world. Um, in the real medieval world, also in the real ancient Greek world, it's clear that people of different skin colours, different nationalities, different city states, were travelling quite frequently between all these different places. We've not that long ago, for example, there's evidence in Roman London for people travelling, not just goods travelling from China and settling in London. So huge amounts of distance and therefore opportunity to see lots of different types of people. Broadly speaking, in this game, most people are fairly olive-skinned Greek-type people. You do see occasionally people, for example, who clearly have come maybe from an African city-state or from the Middle East, and I imagine actually once I do go round into the Aegean, it's going to get much more complicated, because it was much more complicated. But also as well, it doesn't feel as though, and I think quite rightly, it doesn't feel as though they're shoving it down your throat. They're not sort of saying you must see that this person is counter to your idea of what ancient Greece was. It's much more a case of, well, here are some people. Now, occasionally, I was aware. I have to say, I was aware that sometimes I was thinking to myself, I wonder what a lay person would think of this this black woman, for example, being in this setting, and I can't help but wonder whether or not hopefully that's just an issue that is increasingly becoming less and less relevant, because increasingly with these sorts of conversations happening, people are understanding that actually there was quite a lot of movement in the ancient world, and it was possible, I mean, for example, the ivory bangle lady in York, someone from a North African Roman province who lived and worked in York and died in York, there was these, it's all over the place. But also it's interesting that in the ancient world, and I talked about this in another video with Dr. Paul Harrison, in the ancient world, what mattered was your citizenship status. It wasn't what you looked like, it was what you were in terms of what who was backing you up, Yeah. So if you're an Egyptian citizen, that's what comes first. If you're a Roman citizen, that's what comes first. If you're and it's very clear as well, and quite rightly in this game, if you're a Spartan, for example, that's what comes first. It's not where your parents came from.
This is Sparta.
Exactly. It's not what your, for example, what your skin color was. These other things, these other factors in terms of skin color being associated with citizenship, etc., are comparatively modern problems, and it's really quite hard to put your finger on exactly when they start. Arguably, they start, I guess, with the rise of, for example, medieval global empires needing to define a broader sense of citizenship that isn't necessarily tied down to a place, but also that keeps the place where the empire is based at its heart. But in the ancient world, that wasn't the case, and I think that's also reflected in this game. It simply isn't being presented as an issue, and I think quite rightly. So that's a long-winded way of answering the question, but I think, it is something which is on lots of people's minds at the moment, and I think it's right that we do question what we see, but I also think that this shouldn't be reduced down to quotas either. So I've seen some elements of right-wing media and press reacting to, say, BBC resources on teaching Roman Britain that have a black family in the Roman world, an officer, God forbid, in the Roman world.
We made one of those responses Muppet of the Month a few months back, didn't we?
Yeah, we did, yeah. And those people, they're uncomfortable with that possibility, even though most of the Roman army, certainly in parts of the north of England, were from the Netherlands and from North Africa. You had some Italians as well, but so again, I always come back to this element of it's not our job to make people feel comfortable. It's also not our job to try and mitigate what the reality was for any sort of political means. And I think in this game, quite rightly, they're simply showing you a world. They're not. You don't feel that they're having to include 10% ethnic minority or whatever. You're just seeing a patchwork of people, and quite rightly, because ancient Greece was a immensely complex, interconnected place. So,
and just funny, I mean, have they done what they did with Origins set in ancient Egypt? Have they produced educational resources alongside the standard game?
not in the game, no. I know that in Assassin's Creed Origins there was a game mode where you could play and there'd be lots of notation and this sort of thing. In the copy that I've got, at least, no. And as far as I can tell, no, they haven't.
Right.
So, and maybe that's just because, as far as they're aware, I know that ancient Egypt is, I think it's still an element of the curriculum in the US, I think. Certainly is in the UK. And I think Greece is much less commonly taught, even though it is an element of the curriculum in the UK. So, so that probably would have gone down quite well with teachers here, but it's not in the game. No, but there is lots of potential for using it as a learning tool, definitely, without a doubt. So this is probably the longest watching brief we've ever recorded. And so, with that in mind, I think we should probably bring it to an end. But
you certainly should.
But hopefully, we've achieved our goal of covering some important issues in depth, and hopefully, you guys at home haven't been entirely, or indeed our viewer at home hasn't been entirely bored out of their mind. Hopefully, you guys.
And if not, they can always shell out 40, 60 quid, whatever, and spend the evening in ancient Greece.
Exactly. As ever, Andy, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure. And you guys at home, thank you very much for watching. As ever, until next time, do take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.